In the northern part of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, west of Marquette, somewhere in the small city of Negaunee, once stood the Bigboy graveyard. Every so often, images of this graveyard circulate the internet, showing several decaying and broken statues of the titular Bigboy himself. Paint chipping, parts missing, former icons stripped of all their dignity and glory. But what exactly was this graveyard? How did these big boys come to be here? What happens to mascots when they're no longer needed? And what does the future hold for Bigboy restaurants as a whole? To people outside of Michigan, Bigboy might be less of a familiar face. Perhaps you live in the Midwest and you have fond memories of Frisch's Bigboy. Maybe you're in California and you've heard stories about the heyday of Bob's Bigboy, or Leo's, or Shoney's, or Shap's. However, in Michigan, it's a little bit of a different story. Bigboy is still here. And while the restaurant isn't held in high regards these days, it's still easy to find one. Many of them still trapped in the 80s or the early 90s, perpetually unrenovated and surprisingly expensive. Here, they're a staple of American diner food, well known and mostly just tolerated. Are these Bigboy restaurants the same as others that can be found around the country? The answer is both yes and no, and surprisingly more complicated than you might be expecting. I sure know that I was not expecting it to be this complicated, but here I am. The original Bigboy restaurant was opened in 1936 in Glendale, California, as Bob's Pantry. Founder Bob Wyan had learned about the restaurant industry by working odd jobs at various restaurants around town, and when it came to opening his own, he had a secret weapon, the first double-decker hamburger, known more commonly now as a double hamburger. 2 patties on 1 bun, together at last. This new burger was a hit, and Wyan opened a couple more locations in California before striking a deal with David Frisch of Cincinnati to allow for Bigboy locations to be franchises on the East Coast. The first Frisch's Bigboy opened in 1947 and was allowed to make subtle changes to the brand that would someday set the West Coast and East Coast Bigboy locations apart, except for Michigan, but we're getting to that. This included distinct mascots, even though some Frisch's still use the original Bigboy mascot statues instead of their newer East Coast versions. Today, Frisch's Bigboy is a completely independent company from the original Bob's Bigboy, and because of how close Cincinnati, Ohio is to Michigan, you would think that the rest of this video would focus on this iteration of Bigboy restaurants. But you would be wrong. Michigan Big Boys are a spin-off of another franchisee agreement between the Elias brothers of Michigan and Bob Wyan. In 1952, the Elias brothers changed the name of their current diner to Elias Brothers Big Boy and worked directly with Wyan to redesign the Big Boy mascot into the more familiar Big Boy we know of today. They also helped to create a comic book featuring a whole cast of Big Boy characters. Originally published by Timely Comics, the company that would go on to become Marvel, the series was initially written by none other than Stan Lee and would go on to have 466 issues until its cancellation in 1996. Because of the differing mascot designs on the East and West Coast, for a time there were 2 different versions of the series published with both versions of the Big Boy. This isn't very relevant to the story, but I thought it was neat. In 1987, the Elias brothers purchased the West Coast Big Boy chain from its current owner, Marriott, and moved the headquarters to Warren, Michigan. Over the years, other franchises spun off into their own companies, such as Shoney's or Shap's, but nowadays the 2 main Big Boy franchises are Frisch's and the Big Boy Restaurants International, originally owned by the Elias brothers. Of the 69 Big Boy restaurants still operating in the United States, give or take a few that might have closed during the pandemic, 5 are in California, 2 are in Ohio, 1 is in Nevada, 1 is in North Dakota, 1 is in Wisconsin, 2 are in Thailand, yes, Thailand, the country, Thailand, and 59 are in Michigan. Oh, and 274 are in Japan, but we'll get back to that in a little bit. Suffice it to say, it's pretty common to find a Big Boy restaurant in Michigan. Now, that's not even touching the tip of the Big Boy restaurant iceberg, but this video is not about the history of Big Boy restaurants as a whole. This video is about the Big Boy graveyard and the mascot statues that ended up there. So let's move on to the history of the mascot itself. The first iteration of the Big Boy mascot dates back to 1937, and his design was based on a real person, young Richard Woodruff, who at 6 years old wandered into the original Bob's Big Boy restaurant, where Wyan was working on coming up with a snappy name for his double-decker hamburger. The first iteration of the Big Boy mascot was fairly lumpy, with a vague expression, and it was this unremarkable design that led to Frisch's Big Boys getting their own version of the mascot for the majority of the East Coast. The more familiar version of the mascot, and the model for statues featured outside many Big Boy restaurants, would not appear until the mid-50s, and it was this design that would, more or less, manage to stand the test of time. The statues themselves were made of fiberglass and were put outside the doors of many of the Big Boy restaurants. The original ones were 16 feet tall, however nowadays it's more common to find the smaller, 4-foot tall statues at remaining Big Boy locations. There were also statues that were located on top of tall, attention-grabbing, rotating signs. However, many of these have since been removed due to maintenance issues and changing public ordinances forbidding them. So finally, this leads us back to the Upper Peninsula, back to Negaunee and its fabled Big Boy graveyard. The website UP Supply Company details in a blog entry from 2013 the experience of seeing the Big Boy graveyard all the way back in 2001. Unfortunately, the Big Boy graveyard was not so much a graveyard as it was a dump site for what might have been the remnants of several failed franchisee locations. There were 3 Big Boy statues at the graveyard in total, 1 toppled on its side and 2 standing upright, with one of the standing ones missing its signature hamburger in its palm. These photographs do the rounds on social media every so often, eliciting exciting posts from people who want to make the journey to see it. But alas, if you haven't already noticed, I've been referring to the Big Boy graveyard in past tense, because the Big Boy graveyard is no more. And while there were rumors of other Big Boy graveyards in Michigan, the people who know their locations aren't sharing with the public, which is honestly for the best. Unlike other brands, Big Boy seemingly doesn't have instructions for what to do with their mascots. Animatronic Pizza Rat restaurant Chuck E. Cheese requires that all character costumes and animatronics must be destroyed in the event of a store closure. The same goes for retired Disney mascot costumes, or mascot costumes for government figures such as Woodsy Owl, the anti-pollution owl, if you didn't know. Woodsy costumes are infamously required by government law to be burned beyond recognition, and yes, that is the exact wording they used. I have a whole video on that and the history of Woodsy Owl himself if you would like to check that out. However, Big Boy isn't the only chain restaurant that has had a secret graveyard of forgotten fiberglass characters. In 1968, South Carolina entrepreneur Eugene Broom created a proprietary way to tenderize chicken with honey and opened a series of fried chicken fast food restaurants called Yogi Bear's Honey Fried Chicken, featuring the iconic Hanna-Barbera character Yogi Bear himself. The restaurants, which opened several locations throughout the South in the late 60s and early 70s, featured fiberglass statues of Yogi and other licensed characters such as Boo Boo and Ranger Smith. These statues are manufactured by American Fiberglass, who also made Big Boy statues for certain franchisees. Oh.